And over here, we're going to get started with Mr. Benedict Churchus. He is going to be speaking about analytics. He's one of the analytics engineers over here at hackajob. So it's always nice to share the floor with one of my fellow colleagues. And we're going to be talking about stakeholders and trust.
Well, Natalia already gave me a bit of an introduction. So I'm an analytics engineer at hackajob. We're going to talk about what an analytics engineer is in general. It's something that's kind of really emerged, I would say, in the last 2-3 years as like something within the data industry. I've sort of spent the last 5 years in data, and we're coming up to 3 now. So like it was 2 when I first sent this out, and now I'm coming up to my 3rd year in it. But I've kind of worked a lot of different jobs. I've been an analytics engineer for the last 2, but I kind of started in sort of data support, moved into like 3rd line support, if anyone remembers that at all, done some DBA work, been a data analyst, and then now I'm an analytics engineer. Whenever I come to see these talks and things like that, I think it's always worth talking about sort of maybe the history of data analysis, but more about how people understand it. And one thing that people tend to show or tend to see is something like this, right? This is the 1864 Broad Street pump, right? This is by a guy called John Snow, not the Channel 4 presenter, but he was looking at a cholera outbreak in London. And what he was doing was, if you see all the marks next to those street names, he's got a big old tally of where the cholera cases were within London. And he's marked a little dot right in the center of the water pump and where the highest density of cases were. And it turned out to be the source of the cholera infection. And by kind of using data analysis and using some visualization, he kind of managed to solve that problem through it. Another example I see quite a lot of the time as well is this one. This is about Napoleon's invasion of Russia, or his attempted invasion of Russia. If you know your history, you know it didn't go very well. But this is by a guy called Charles Minard, and it was done in 1812. And again, another like early example of data visualization. He called this a tableau graphique. And no prizes for guessing which data visualization tool uses its name Tableau from it. But on the left-hand side, you can see a wide bar, which is representing sort of the number of the troops when he began in the West, and then the bar gets thinner by the time he gets to Russia. So you can see the route of how many soldiers dropped off and why the invasion might have failed in that first bit. Both of these are really quite cool, right? I think they're interesting to talk about. I think they're interesting to understand, but realistically, it's probably not what you're going to be dealing with on your day-to-day basis, working in sort of data analytics or analytics engineering, whatever you want to talk about. The history I have of it, at least in my workflow, is much more about inheriting random reports from people or doing manual backups of databases or just using Google Sheets for a lot of the time. One of the earliest speakers, if you were on today, a guy called Aaron, was talking about this concept of shadow IT. And it was a really great way of talking about the data ecosystem that gets created when a lot of your stakeholders are using data in silos and things like that. And the reason why that's happened is because a lot of these tasks were really, really manual, really quite tricky to use and quite tricky to do. And they were slow, right? You had to have someone manually running a report. You had someone manually taking a backup of your database. It was a slow task. It meant that some of these other tasks that a company needed had to be done by people or else they'd never get done at all. And that's why you kind of end up in the situation when you eventually join a company that you kind of need an analytics engineer. And one analytics engineer is someone, if I'm super cynical, someone that DBT invented to sell more product, but it's kind of using all of those tools that I talked about earlier, all of those processes, and using the tools around them to kind of really improve a business. If I had to describe what I kind of did in a kind of couple of sentences, it's turning business logic into actionable data logic and being able to kind of take those stakeholder requests and kind of moving through it. A lot of the talks, if you've been around today, have been about stakeholders being a big thing about it, how people talk to stakeholders, what their requirements are, and kind of what they need and what they do. And I think I wanted to talk about sort of how you kind of get buy-in from stakeholders in the first place. There's a key relationship. You don't know exactly who your stakeholders are. But as an analytics engineer, your kind of pipeline may look a bit like this. So sort of picture in the top left-hand corner is using a product called DBT, or data build tool. If you've not heard it before, it's kind of one of the big kind of innovations, I'd say, in the data space in a while. It's just basically using software engineering practices to put your SQL into a more readable format and more repeatable format for whatever tasks you need it for. It's mainly using SQL logic and then occasionally a bit of YAML as well, if you understand that. On our right-hand side, we've got some examples of some visualization software. You might have seen them called dashboards before, or reports. You've got Power BI, you've got Tableau, you've got ThoughtSpot, lots of different concepts there. I do a bit of that as well, but as a platform engineer, don't get stuck in that sort of hole of just making sort of dashboards and reports. Your whole point is to try and support the ecosystem below that. In the bottom left-hand corner, I've got an example of something that we're kind of coming across now more so, is sort of this idea of a query builder. For a long time, sort of, you have to either learn SQL to interrogate a database, or you kind of really didn't have much interaction with it. Because of the tools you've got as an analytics engineer, you can potentially start using kind of query builders to make sure that whatever questions that your company is asking, they're able to ask them themselves from the data sets that you create in your dbt file and then push them through. So that's sort of like the current workflow, I'd say, of an analytics engineer. And if you do all of these things right, like you are looking at making the right decisions along the way. Because one way you can get really quick stakeholder buy-in is by building a data ecosystem that is quite cost effective as you go along. If you're seen to already be given the business value, your stakeholders will go, this person knows how to give us a hand and make sure we're heading in the right direction. And with that as well, I think SQL or SQL as a language is a language that is actually quite hard to not produce results. And what I mean by that is that you can write an SQL query and it can return you a number most of the time. You can make something that will give you a number if you understand some of the tables, and whether or not that number is right or wrong doesn't really matter, or even if it's relevant. What's really important with SQL and data is that you're asking it the right questions. And in order to do that, you need to ask the right people, right? And these are your stakeholders. So the whole kind of pattern of asking the right people, asking the right questions, is by asking the right people. And in data, I think there's a lot of this understanding that even though I might not see myself as like technical as some other software engineers, I'm still quite technical to stakeholders that are interacting with systems or tools for the first time. And people can get quite scared sometimes. So you want to work with them and make sure they're not doing things wrong. Especially if they've been creating their own Google Sheets before or something like that, people tend to get quite embarrassed and be like, oh, don't want you to see it. I'm like, that's not the point. We're trying to help you here. We're trying to make your job easier and more effective and more efficient. And it's a really common concept within software engineering of sort of this idea of pair programming, right? You're sharing experience with another developer, and it's a really kind of tried and tested way in which you can improve the quality of your code and things like that. In data, you need to think about your stakeholders like you're pair programming with them, right? They are the domain experts about things within your business. They understand sales better than you, or marketing better than you. Natalia definitely knows our customers better than I ever will. That in order to collaborate with them, you need to kind of start working on it together. You've got the technical knowledge that you can make those things streamlined. They've got the domain knowledge. And then in order to kind of really understand how it's all kind of working out, even though I spoke about earlier that you've got this whole ecosystem that gets created around the Google Sheets, one of the things you do, well, at least what I've done when I joined companies for the first time, is try and see what Google Sheets they've got. They're often a really good indicator of a problem or things that a company is dealing with day to day, just because of the vast amount of sheets that you might have in general. Often as well, people will talk about like special Google Sheets within the organization that make it run, even though they might not necessarily do, or the people that created them, like they're wizards or something like that. The thing with that is that you've immediately got stakeholders there. If the people that are creating the Google Sheets understand what the data problems are within your business, when you join, you can kind of talk to them, get a real understanding of what problems existed, why they existed, and then use your expertise to potentially help them as well. So yeah, if you've done all of those things, right, if you are collaborating with people, if you're working with them on a consistent basis, then you kind of start potentially, when it comes to challenging stakeholders or dealing with them about data, to actually start kind of working alongside them with that sort of thing. And the main data kind of pain points I see in which you kind of maybe have to challenge stakeholders sometimes are kind of the following, right? So inconsistent definitions, and by that I mean there's probably some terms in your business that you use that what the actual reality of them changes from person to person, that they're not really used on the same hymn sheet, if you want to call it that, with understanding them. Hard-coded numbers are another thing I see a lot in Google Sheets, of a static number that is used to represent something that maybe somebody can't acquire in general. A lack of automation. By that, I mean like manually copying and pasting a lot of the time just to try and get some data. And that is the big time consumer as well. I've very rarely met someone and get said to them, if I remove that element of your your reporting kind of workflow, would that be okay? And they've gone no, like they've really enjoyed it. Like it's a really quick way to get buy-in. The final one is actually kind of the big one. And this is something that I potentially was going to do this whole presentation about, which was this idea of like misunderstanding of data in general. And by that, I mean sort of what statistics are, or how people interpret sort of large numbers, or even the actual kind of technical element of the tools they're using and things like that. And just making some errors that maybe ended up giving you wrong numbers in general just because of the process and workflow. All of these are and can be solvable by working along stakeholders and getting sort of a good relationship with them. And so I just have a bit of water. Cool. Inconsistent definitions is probably like a really important one. And I've got a slight story about this, because when I worked in support, I once worked with on like some servers, old school servers that were on premises, and you kind of had to, they were a real physical service, not in the cloud or anything like that. And one of the days I couldn't connect to the server when I had to remote desktop into it. And a colleague was talking to me about what was going on. And I was like, oh, the server's on fire, meaning like it's not working. It's just whatever it is. Like that colleague got the wrong end of the stick completely, thought the server was on fire. And the next thing I know, I get a call in 3 hours by one of my heads of department, like, I'm at the server room now, nothing is on fire. I'm like, I got in a bit of trouble for that, but I learned my lesson that sometimes what you understand as a concept is not what someone else understands as a concept. Especially as I see a lot of businesses nowadays try and really commit to a North Star sort of metric, or you've got some acronyms within your business and how people use those metrics. The way in which you solve this is that you ultimately need to get your stakeholders around the table and just make them agree on what that definition is. And when you've got that definition, you start using tools to really support that argument within it. On the left-hand side, I've got a little tool for Notion there. Notion is a sort of a notebooking and like internal knowledge-based sort of resource. If you've got a definition for something and you've agreed upon it with your stakeholders, stick it in Notion. As an analytics engineer, you've probably got access to your own reports, write it up in DBT, make sure that everywhere you've got access to that definition from there on out, that is the source of truth for it. Also a little Loom sort of logo on the right-hand side as well. I sometimes find it useful that some people don't really find reading as useful as potentially even looking at it visually. And talking through people on a video, like we're doing right now, is a much easier way to understand and grasp concepts. One of the things about inconsistent definitions and the modern data stack as well is that you can be wrong, right? That first round of what you get in terms of this is what the definition is will sometimes be disagreed upon, right? But you can point someone to your Notion or to your repo in your DBT repo and go, this is what the logic I'm using is. Let's have a conversation about it. Where am I wrong? Where am I right? And if they are right and you want to change it, just update your Notions, update your DBT, and then update your Looms. It's that iterative feedback. And that's a lot of the freedom the modern data stack gives you nowadays that potentially was a lot harder before. You couldn't find out where all the reports were, but we're using different tools. You can implement it a lot quicker. The second thing I kind of see quite a lot is hard-coded numbers. And this is actually more of a sort of import problem than anything else, is that people know that there potentially are the right numbers somewhere. They just don't know how to get access to them. Maybe they're in a system that they don't know how to get it from, or maybe it requires a calculation that is not as transparent. Maybe it's an inconsistent definition like we spoke about earlier. For that, you can just use an extract tool. So we use Fivetran at hackajob, but just grabbing the actual source of that information. And again, you're dealing with a stakeholder there. You're asking them, if this isn't the right number, then what is the right number? And they'll go, it's actually this number in this other system that we've managed to get access to. That's your job as an analytics engineer, to find those databases, to stitch them together, to write them up in DBT. When we're back in DBT again, and then we're writing it on Notion, we're going, this is the source of this data now. This is how we're dealing with it. The third kind of problem I see a lot of time is a lack of automation. And this is where you can potentially give a lot of value quite quickly, because this is the manual reporting that potentially your colleagues don't really know that you can speed this up in lots of really quick ways. That sometimes it is a case of just grabbing data from Fivetran and spitting out something that someone had to manually put it in before. And maybe that's like a Power BI report in our case. Or even, and I'm not really averse or against this at all, you can put it back into a Google Sheet. If you've got a ticket and you can save someone's time with that, it's going to be so beneficial to them. And it's part of what you're there for. You're there to make a platform. If they're going to use a Google Sheet anyway, and people will still keep using their Google Sheets, you might as well make it quicker for them. The last one I kind of like see quite a lot of the time is this whole concept of misunderstanding data. And like I said earlier, this is probably like the biggest one. I don't know if anyone really remembers during COVID in the UK, but like right in the start of it, there was a big test and trace scheme, and it was implemented by a company called Circa. And there was a big kind of issue where a lot of the data went missing with that. About 16,000 records went missing, and the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, said it was a computer glitch or a computer error. It actually wasn't a computer glitch or a computer error at all. It was exactly intended behavior. What happened is that in data, you use things called CSVs. CSVs hold a lot of data really kind of in very small way. They just got comma separated values between them. And you can hold millions upon millions of rows in quite a sort of consistent way. When you save a CSV into Excel and then save over it, it's got a hard limit of how many rows you can import at a time, and it will just cut it all off. So what would happen was someone didn't understand the relationship between CSVs and Excels. They'd saved all of this data, lost all this data, and before you know it, it's a national news for the next week and a half. With this is one that is only ever going to be really solved by time and collaborating. And alongside Loom and Notion, I've got a Google Calendar. This is something where if you want to work in analytics, it's a really great moment where you're the people person, you're the person that sits between that technical side and the sort of business side. You're there to kind of represent both those sort of groups of people, and just make sure you pick the time to do the diary. Natalia called out that I do my office hours on Thursdays that people can use and things like that. And over time, people understand that you kind of use that time. I was trying to explain that also a lot of these concepts are really quite tricky as well. If you ever have worked in software engineering and talk to someone non-technical, try and explain to them what recursion is, right? It's really quite difficult for someone to understand. Or even loops, right? Just repeat an action or further. I had a conversation with my mum last week about the concept of nulls, and she didn't understand it. I was like, it's just nothing. She's like, no, but even nothing is something. I was like, no, nothing is just nothing. And she was like, but what about like if it's white space? I'm like, no, white space is also something. So you need to just really, there are just some concepts that just take time to understand and people to get their heads around. And if you kind of do all those things, one thing I will say is that your whole success as sort of a data team is often measured by how much people are working with the tools you're using and things like that. And your solution should always be wrapped around them. There are BI tools that I prefer using. There are transform tools that I prefer using, but ultimately it's about what your end users will actually use. It doesn't matter what you want to visualize something on, because your job is to learn those things if you don't understand them, or you've got the expertise there. 1 second. Like almost always, like, and oh, this is my hot take as well. If you guys have a tool called Microsoft Fabric, Microsoft are launching their own entire Microsoft data sort of tool suite at the moment. I think it's going to be really quite successful, and not necessarily because it's going to be the best product on the market straight away, but more so, I think, just because it's going to be very convenient for people to buy that package. They can buy a whole package and go, this is how my data works end to end now, and my users can get on board it straight away. And like I said, people will still use their Google Sheets. If your data platform isn't being used by people, that isn't a stakeholder problem. That's a data platform problem, right? And you need to understand and revisit your concepts again. I had a bit of a shorter presentation, I think, other people. So I think that was everything I had sort of down in the end. But I'm happy to take sort of questions and say that to Talia.
Benedict, thank you so much. I feel like I loved, for example, the graph representations of what analyzing data was at the beginning, because I don't think we realize how history also plays a part in us starting to visualize data. So love that, and love that you also just show us the tools and engage with stakeholders, because we don't realize that, especially maybe starting at smaller companies and then growing into bigger ones, you do have to have these difficult conversations with stakeholders. So I do have a few questions, but for all the participants, feel free to ask anything within the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. So yeah, feel free to share them, and then I'll give them a read. But for now, for example, we were talking about having these conversations with stakeholders. Do you have maybe a couple, maybe 3 tips of how you can engage with these difficult conversations?
I think you want to really understand the problem to begin with, right? You're there to collaborate, like I said, with someone as well. Often challenging conversations, nobody's wrong, like it's just a misunderstanding. And if you can align on what the actual question is, you'll be able to do it. I don't know, I like using my own personality with it as well. I like having a bit of a laugh with somebody. I like asking how their day is. Treat them like a person. You're not this like hard-nosed engineer who's there to fix things so they don't understand it. You're there to talk to your colleague and solve a problem for them with each other as well. Don't be afraid to kind of like just share a bit of your personality. Let them know that you're there as well to help them out. And that's pretty cool. That's like a third tip. What I'm trying to think is a third tip. I don't know, maybe ask them about like how they got to this point, right? Like what is the history behind it? I talked about a lot about history in terms of data in general, but also as well about how a business got to this point as well. And if you can really empathize with that and go, there's no blame, no one's ever in the wrong for why data exists in a certain way. It's just the way it's happened. And then we can have a constructive conversation about how we can make it better. That's the whole point of it. If you make people feel like they're not comfortable sharing things with you, that data is still going to exist. It's still going to happen. People are still going to use those things. They're just not going to tell you. And then it will never get fixed. And then you're wondering why you're not giving value to your company in the way you want to.
Yeah. Is there maybe like a thought process that goes through your head when you join, like in the first instance, a company, for example, that you're like, right, I need these sort of information, this sort of data. Where do I begin?
Yeah, so I think my main thing that I like to do is I like to listen a lot for like the first month at least. Sometimes like shorter, sometimes longer. Just really understand what the current ecosystem is like. And that requires we talk about challenging sort of stakeholders. If you're joining a company for the first time, just listen. Just understand what the problems are, understand what the platform is before you start suggesting things. Because there might be something that you don't understand or a quirk of some information or data that is actually relevant and why it exists there. And you'll find the answers to that before you go through it as well. And one thing I like personally doing it, and it is on that SQL technical side of it, I like just like looking at the database. I like seeing if there's an ERD or an entity relationship diagram and just kind of having a look through it myself, messing around with some queries. Also use the platform. Like hackajob is a platform tool that I use as well. Line it up with the SQL tables to the actual platform tables and like understand what the link is between them. You might sometimes find that there are like some really small things within the product that are actually the way they are because of the database is the way it is, because the product is the way it is, and you can start cross-referencing it. So yeah, there's a few tips there.
Definitely. And then, for example, how would you measure impact then? Like, because you start with a set data at the beginning, and then you start presenting, filtering, getting the numbers in, and then you also want to be able to project future growth or whatever it is.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like often as a data platform team, you're actually giving numbers to other teams, right? They're doing all of them with it. I know we've just got a new product in CS, right? That we're helping enabling by putting a load of our new metrics through it. That is how the data platform squad like has enabled. It's a force multiplier team for something like CS or RevOps in our case with Plan Out. I'll call them out. It's a great product where we're putting the metrics in through that. In terms of being able to measure direct value with data, it is just about people using your tools. I know for a fact that I can see the metrics that Joe and I both worked on are being used. They're being used in reports and Plan Out. They're used to be calculating health scores. I can attribute at least some value there by the conversations that we've had in the lead up to it. Quite a lot of these modern tools as well have got usage stats on the back of them as well. I know how many people check out the Power BI reports that we're looking at as well. Also as well, there is that level of like, if you want to look at qualitative data, that's always useful and always like, right? It's always useful to quantitative data, sorry. If you want to look at qualitative data, just talk to your colleagues as well. Say, are they using those tools? Are they finding them useful? Because if they aren't, cool, let them tell you there is something you need to work out there. Like I said, like it's mostly always going to be a platform problem rather than an actual sort of like stakeholder problem.
Yeah. And then, for example, because these are data-driven conversations,
right?
There's some people that will feel very comfortable talking about data, analyzing data. I feel like that's a skill. Not everyone can look at data and analyze data. How can you bring people that are within the company to start using those tools, get comfortable with them? And yeah.
Yeah, so at hackajob, the way in which we started is that we looked at where the majority of like manual reporting was going on and kind of removing some steps from it and automating it and kind of being able to give people like sort of access to it that way. The truth of it is no one's ever going to use everything. That is just the reality of it. If anyone's ever got 100% usage metric within their company, I want to know why and how, because you probably like you've got $1 million idea already for you. But I think it's about identifying those users anyway, right? Even without like companies that haven't got maybe formalized data teams, we'll always have people that are interested in data. And part of your role as well is like identifying those people and being like, I think we can really help each other here. There's a lot of manual work in terms of like having conversations with people that you need to do.
Yeah, definitely. And then the last question for me would be, how can you ensure that data is accurate and reliable? Because sometimes like we have so many different mediums from where we're gathering information. How can we keep up to date?
Yeah, so I think we had this question when I was doing it in person as well. I think this comes down to some data practices as well. The truth of it is that data is often very much a point in time anyway. What you're measuring yesterday will potentially update tomorrow. If you've got a system like ours, where the state of the candidate is going through various different levels, and when they were hired or when they got brought into the system can change depending on how their interviews went and things like that. I think it's really important to be kind of like assure people that that is reflective of something as a point in time. And if you've done those things, like I said, if you've got a consistent definition that somebody understands, and if they don't understand it, have a conversation with them, say this is what the definitions are. I will say as well, if you ever like putting out like a report on behalf of the data team, that should be really like high quality or standard, like you want to put out there, because that's immediately what people go. They're like, I don't think I trust those numbers. I'm going to keep coming back to this whole concept. Have a conversation with them. Why don't they trust those numbers? What do they not understand? Is it that they don't feel like they're not reflective of other numbers they've seen before? Maybe the filters aren't really reflective of what's going on there. There's a lot of edge cases that happen both in messy human life and in data as well, right? I've met so many people, not maybe at hackajob, but in other companies that sales, like, well, that sales number actually should be this number because technically it was a Wednesday, it was a leap year. And I was like, that's cool. That's not my role to tell you why that number is that number. That's your job, right? You can give that context to the business. I'm giving you the number. This is the definition for it. The number is the number. Like you've got all the context around it.
Yeah. What's been the thing that you've enjoyed the most about being an analytics engineer?
Oh, I like talking to people. I like giving people that moment to kind of go that people understand data more than anything, right? Data is, this is going to sound like so cliche. Data is all around us. People are always kind of interacting with data, and getting people to maybe think about, get my friends to tell them their phone isn't listening to them, by the way. You're just giving your phone a lot of data, and your phone is then actually predicting what sort of person you are based on those trends and data. Getting people to think about things in a sort of way is something I really enjoy. And getting people to kind of really understand the power of it as well. Being able to kind of bring it into their own lives or into their workflows. That's cool.
I love that, the power behind the data and just being able to bring everyone together and have these conversations.
Yeah, like I don't see any downside to people kind of understand their data they're dealing with more, especially when you like work with colleagues and you get to that point where the data they're giving you is of a higher quality because they understand what they can do with it all of a sudden. And maybe they're not focusing on the tasks that are in their head really complex, but actually from a data point of view, quite simple, right? It's quite simple to add certain filters or slice it this way. You start a high level of conversation, I want to say, in terms of the data and what you can really do with it. And you do some really cool stuff with it as well. And find out, especially when you're in a unique workplace, you can find some really cool trends that maybe no one else has ever seen before.
So true. I feel like that's when you can also understand how your company is functioning, and sometimes even understand how you can use different data to win other points, maybe with clients, maybe in conversations internally, and be able to grow your company as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. When you get people thinking about data in that sort of way of actually, I know a customer, right? That's your expertise. I know this customer has been looking for these answers to this question for so long, and I think we've got the data to help them. Yeah.
And how do we actually get to that number to present it? Just beautiful.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, Benedict, this was an amazing chat. I loved it. Having data conversations with you on a Friday afternoon. Really appreciate all the insight, all the knowledge.